Today's video, it's a summary video about all the PCEM emulation machines that I made, and basically the timeline of each type of machine. So basically here you have the timeline, the years, type of CPUs, video card, 3D accelerator, audio, RAM, floppy disk drives, hard disk drives, optical, and operating systems. So 1982 to 1985 was the Intel 8086 and 8088 processor timeline. So a lot of people during that timeline had those type of processors like IBM XT computers and stuff like that, and XT compatibles. And the most common type of video card was monochrome and CGA. Monochrome is no color, just one color. It could either be green or sometimes it's orange or something, different type of colors. For Hercules, I think it was gray. And then they didn't really have any audio cards or audio devices back in 82 to 85. Just typically sound came out of your PC speakers, which didn't sound good at all. RAM was about 640 kbytes of RAM. People had floppy disks, 5¼ inch, 360 kbytes. Hard drives were not very common. Some people did have hard drives, maybe 10 megabytes or so. Optical drives didn't exist. Operating system was MS-DOS 1.0 and 2.0. And when you get to 1986 to 85 to 89, I guess this was kind of like the 286 era. You had computers that had EGA. Most of them had EGA. Some of them had VGA as well, especially the computers that were released in 1987 and 88. But VGA was quite expensive back in the 1980s. Even in 1989, it was expensive. Computers had PC speakers, a lot of them. Some people had ad-lib sound cards, which was released in 1987. RAM was about 640 to 1 megabyte, and most programs ran within this limit or parameter. Floppy drives, 5¼ 1.2 megabyte to and 3.5 inch 1.44 megabyte floppy disk. Sometimes they had 360 kbytes as well. You could still use them. Some programs had it, but it would you would have more disks. So for one of these, you would have maybe 4 of those. Hard drives did kind of like exist. 10 megabytes, 30 megabytes, where the operating system was copied on the hard drive. Operating systems, MS-DOS 3.0 to 4.0. 1989 to 1991, this is, I could say, the 386 era, SX era. You also had DX computers. VGA was probably the most common. Some computers had Super VGA, but VGA was the most common. You had ad-lib sound card. You had MT Roland as well. Those were more expensive sound cards. You also had Sound Blaster. RAM requirements was anywhere from 1 megabyte to 4 megabytes around this era. Same type of floppy disks. Floppy disks really didn't change very much from late 1989, late 1980s to, I guess, till the end of the 1990s. Hard drives range from anywhere from 40 megabytes to 100 megabytes. You started to see optical drives around this time. 1X to 2X. Operating systems, Windows 4.0 to Windows 5.0. then you reach 1992 to 1994. This would be the 386DX, 486SX, and 486DX era. You typically had computers with, I think, ISA SVGA card with 1 megabyte of RAM. Audio, Sound Blaster, Sound Blaster Pro, Sound Blaster 16. RAM, 4 megabytes to 16 megabytes. Floppy drive the same. Hard drives, 100 megabyte to 500 megabyte. CD-ROM, 4X. MS-DOS, 5.0. 6.22, 6.21. MS Windows, Microsoft Windows 3.0. So you started to see graphical user interface based operating systems, because you had more powerful computers that could handle it. So 1994 to 1996, socket 4 Pentium 4, socket 5 Pentium, and you also had 486DX, 100 megahertz as well. Kind of like overlaps here as well, the 486DX. Super VGA 2 megabyte VESA, VESA graphics cards. Sound Blaster 16 was common. You also had Sound Blaster 128 as well, and others. 8 megabyte to 128 megabytes. Same floppy drives. You had 3.5 inch 2.88 megabyte high density drives, but those formats weren't really used. I've never seen any software that required 3.5 inch by 2.88 megabytes during the 1990s. But some computers did offer it, but most programs didn't require it. And hard drives, 500 megabytes to 2 gigabytes. And you had optical drives around this time, 4X to 8X. MS-DOS 6.22 was the most common operating system, and MS Windows 3.11. Then from 1996 and onwards, you had Socket 7 Pentiums. You had Super Socket 7 as well, which enabled you to have processors like the K6-2 and K6-3, and this is Pentium MMX, like 166 to 233 MMX. S3 Verge, 2 megabyte to 4 megabyte. This is kind of like a pseudo 3D accelerator video card. Not very good for 3D acceleration, but it was a pretty decent video card overall. You had the Voodoo Rush, which was a video card which had 3D acceleration. It was based on the 3DFX Voodoo 1. ATI Velocity 128, which was another company that made graphics card during this timeline in the 1990s up until the early 2000s. Yeah, for 3D accelerator, the most common one was 3DFX Voodoo 4 megabyte. You also had something called a Matrox M3D, which I also had back in the day. It wasn't as good as a 3DFX Voodoo card. I eventually replaced the Matrox M3D, which was based on a NEC Power VR chip graphics chip. It really wasn't as good as this, so I replaced it with that later on in 1997. And the Sound Blaster I had back then was Sound Blaster 128, but you also had Sound Blaster 32. 32 megabytes of 256 megabytes. Same floppy disks requirements. Hard drive 850 megabytes of 4 gigabytes. Back in the day, hard drives were notoriously unreliable, and they had to be replaced sometimes once every year. They really didn't last long as the hard drives that we have today. And we use SSDs as well, which are even more reliable than hard drives. So back in the day, hard drive reliability was an issue. Optical drive 16x CD. We did start seeing DVD ROM drives around this timeline. Operating system, MS Windows 9.95 was very common. 1998 to 1999, Pentium II, Pentium III, Slot 1, Pentium 2s and Pentium 3s. Common video cards were Voodoo Banshee, which was based on, I think, Voodoo 2, which also had 2D features, acceleration. Riva TNT, this is a company, NVIDIA made this. NVIDIA is a very powerful company today, but back then it wasn't really a very strong company, but today it is. This was a pretty decent 3D accelerator video card, although they did have some driver issues and stuff like that. It wasn't as good as a 3DFX Voodoo card, which had very solid drivers and had its own API like I think Glide, which was very good for 3D accelerated games and programs. Voodoo 3 2000, 3000, and 3050 was common around this time. You also had 3D accelerators like the Voodoo 2, 8 megabyte and 12 megabyte. I also had this back in 1998, which was a pretty good 3D accelerator, and it was coupled with the S3 Verge, basically. Audio, Sound Blaster 32, common. Sound Blaster 128 was also common. Very inexpensive video sound card. Back then, sound cards weren't incorporated onto the motherboard, so you had to buy a sound card separately, and Sound Blaster was offered pretty inexpensive staple sound cards, and RAM was about 128 megabytes to 512 megabytes. I think 512 megabytes was the most you could put in there on a Windows 98 operating system. Same type of floppy drive. Hard drive ranged from 4 gigabyte to 8 gigabytes. Optical drives, 32X, CD-ROM. You also had DVD ROM drives from this period on. Operating system, MS Windows 98 was very common. So different type of requirements for different type of software. And a common problem we had back in the 1990s was when you had a much faster computer, let's say like a 486, and you tried to run a game like Wing Commander, it would be too fast. And let me show you. On other type of games, on most type of games, it didn't really matter which processor you had. Even if you had the fastest processors, the game would run at a normal speed. As you clearly saw there, some of the games run way too fast if you have a very fast processor. This was a common problem for people who had very high-end computers back in the early 1990s. But people had other problems too. They didn't have the right kind of hardware to get good performance. That was also another issue that people had, which I had back in 1993, because I had a 386SX, and the computer that I had simply couldn't run a lot of the games released in 1993 and onwards. The programs from 1993 and onwards required more memory, at least 4 megabytes of RAM or greater. And the computer that I had only had 1 megabyte of RAM. And some of them even required Super VGA. And I only had standard VGA. So it just became obsolete. And from 1993 to 1999, a lot of hardware became obsolete very quickly. So just from this timeline to 1999, I went through a lot of different computers and graphics cards. So in 1994, I had a Pentium 100 megahertz socket 5, and in 1997, I had or 1996, 1997 or 1996, I'm not sure. I had a Pentium 166 MMX. I think it was 97. And shortly after, I got a K62 350, and then I got upgraded the CPU to a K6 to 450 and a K63 500 or something. This was back in 1998, and I changed that to I got a new computer, which was a Pentium II 400. Actually, first it was a Celeron 400, and I upgraded the CPU to a Pentium II 400. And then I upgraded the CPU from a Pentium II 400 to a Pentium III 500. This was in 1998. 1999, I got a Pentium III 850. And as for the graphics cards, I had a 2 megabyte Super VGA Vesta card. I think it was a Trident TG UI 9440. Got it in 1994. I changed that to a S3 Verge 2 megabyte. And then I had a Voodoo 4 megabyte video card with the S3 Verge in 1997. In 1998, I got a Voodoo 2. I think it was a 12 megabyte 3D accelerator. I replaced that. And in 1999, I had a Voodoo 3 2000 16 megabyte video card. And I went through a lot of hardware back in that time. But as for the sound cards, I just kept the same Sound Blaster 128 that I got in 1995. It didn't change really. Hard drives, I got a number of different hard drives, from a 750 in 1994 to a 2 gigabyte in 1996 to a 4 gigabyte in 1997 to 8 gigabyte in 1999. And as for optical drives, I went through many different ones in the mid 1990s, like a 8X CD-ROM, which came with my Pentium 100 megahertz, and I changed that to a 16X CD-ROM in 1997. And 1998, I replaced that with I didn't replace it, I added a DVD-ROM drive so I could play DVD movies. And I got a CD-ROM 32X. It was a Creative Labs CDRW drive that I got in 1999, so I could write CDs and stuff. So a lot of changes back in the time. So you have to know what kind of machine to use with the games of that era. So that's why I made this chart here. So it's important to know that when you're emulating different type of machines with PCEM or 86 box. That's what I want to share with you today. And if you have any questions, you could leave it in the comment section below. If you like this video, you could leave a like and share it. And thank you